History of space exploration, the mid-1960s. In 1961, after Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, his 15 minutes in space, President Kennedy had announced that by the end of the decade, we would send a man to the moon and return him safely to the Earth. So, how do you do that? Well, the Mercury program flew only one person and went into orbit. We needed to test out a lot of technology before we would send somebody to the moon. And that's where the Gemini missions came in. Gemini, we now have 2 people, as you can see. Capsule is still very small, barely enough room for these 2 people to get in. But this was designed to test all the various components of a mission to the moon. So it tested things like spacewalking. We had to design a spacesuit that would withstand the vacuum of space. Had to work out the techniques of actually moving around in a weightless environment. Rendezvous. This is bringing 2 spacecraft together. Flying around in orbit is not intuitive. If you see something in front of you and you hit the accelerator, so to speak, to catch up, what that's going to do is put you into a higher orbit, and you're going to end up going slower. So you have to slow down, drop into a lower orbit. That lets you catch up, and then you speed up to move into that higher orbit and actually fly side by side. So they had to work out those techniques. Duration. How long can people survive in a weightless environment? Going to the moon and back is going to take a long time. In the Mercury program, our longest flight was 36 hours. Flying to the moon and back, you're going to be in space a minimum of a week and up to 2 weeks. Could the human body survive that? Docking, actually connecting to spacecraft. Okay, we can rendezvous, bring them close together. Can we actually connect them without crashing? Had to test that out. So during the mid-60s, largely as a result of the Gemini program, there were many firsts. But the Soviets had one last first. Alexei Leonov of the Soviet Union did perform the first spacewalk. This will be the last time that the Soviets beat us to something. Our first spacewalk was just shortly after. This is Ed White, walking in space. The device in his hand is like a little thruster that allowed him to maneuver around. Now, his was mainly just floating. We had later Gemini missions where people went out to try to work on spacecraft. We found out that that was a lot harder than we expected, and it was our last Gemini flight where Buzz Aldrin ended up finally working out the details of performing tasks in space. Gemini performed the first rendezvous, and here you see the view from one capsule and how close they got to the other. They flew within a few feet of each other, going about 17,500 miles per hour, because that's the speed in orbit. So they were able to maneuver around each other with ease. Long duration. And this is Jim Lovell and Frank Borman. They got to spend 2 weeks in that incredibly tiny Gemini capsule to see how their bodies felt after all that extended weightlessness. And they came through with flying colors. Docking. Here we have Jim Scott and Neil Armstrong. They performed the first docking. It was a dock with a rocket booster that was put into orbit. So it wasn't another Gemini spacecraft, but just this kind of rocket-looking thing that had a docking ring on one end. They docked successfully, but then they started spinning out of control. The whole thing started spinning out of control. And then they undocked, and then their whole capsule was spinning out of control. It turned out there was a thruster stuck. Neil Armstrong was able to get the capsule back under control. It shortened their flight. They ended up having to come back down to Earth much sooner than anticipated, but his calm and cool under so much pressure is probably a contributing factor to his being chosen for the first moon landing. So, mid-1960s, Gemini program, United States is finally getting ahead of the Soviet Union, and we have now finally perfected the techniques necessary to go to the moon.